So, the United States has just approached Canada seeking a $573 billion railway stabilization package, not proposing one, requesting one. The most formidable economy in recorded history, the nation that spent the past 2 years imposing tariffs, trade barriers, sovereignty encroachments, and relentless economic pressure on its nearest neighbor, has now approached that neighbor asking them to please restore the freight rail service that American industry relies on to survive. Because the North American railway infrastructure, it turns out, is predominantly Canadian. The locomotives are Canadian, the rail lines are Canadian. The logistics systems that coordinate the movement of American grain, American auto components, American crude oil, American chemicals, American timber, and American consumer products are based in Montreal and Calgary. 2 of the 7 Class 1 railroads across North America, Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, are Canadian-owned, Canadian-managed companies operating extensive networks inside the United States on American territory, hauling American cargo and linking American cities. And when Canada redirected its commerce away from the United States toward international markets, the railways followed that commerce. The trains that previously ran southward to Chicago, Detroit, and Memphis are now heading east toward Halifax and Montreal and west toward Vancouver and Prince Rupert, because that is where the economic activity exists today. The fallout was swift. American factories struggled to receive components. American farmers were unable to transport grain. American refineries could not consistently receive crude. American retailers began experiencing difficulty keeping shelves supplied. The estimated cost of the disruption, delayed freight, stalled production, spoiling grain, and compounding inefficiencies rippling through nearly every corner of the American economy, reached $573 billion across 3 years, and Canada said no. Not merely no. Canada simultaneously unveiled a $30 billion east-west rail corridor expansion, a substantial infrastructure commitment designed to permanently channel Canadian freight capacity toward global export terminals and away from the American frontier. The request was rejected. The infrastructure that might have supported American industry is instead being constructed in an entirely different direction, and every dollar of concrete poured into the east-west corridor is a dollar of capacity that will never return to north-south operations. Warren Buffett, who owns BNSF Railway, one of the largest freight carriers across North America, and who has devoted more than 60 years to studying the economics of rail transportation, described it with characteristic directness. This is the most predictable infrastructure crisis in American history. He then explained with the credibility of someone who not only analyzes railways but genuinely owns one, why you cannot conduct economic warfare against the country that manages major segments of your rail network and still expect the trains to arrive on schedule, and why requesting assistance from the very nation you have been pressuring is not a negotiating posture. It is closer to an admission of failure, but the remark that many commentators are calling the most humbling statement ever addressed to an American president by an Allied leader came from Mark Carney. When asked whether Canada would consider Donald Trump's railway stabilization proposal, Carney responded with 9 words that communicated to the United States something no ally has ever previously possessed the leverage, or the rationale, to express. You don't get to break it and then ask us to fix it. To understand how this situation unfolded, you must understand how the North American railway network actually functions and who genuinely controls it. The North American freight rail system is not 3 distinct national networks that simply connect at border crossings. It is one profoundly integrated continental infrastructure built across a century and a half to move goods across the continent with peak efficiency and minimum friction. The U.S.-Canada border is not truly a dividing line within that system. It is more of a seam, nearly invisible during regular operations, seamless in practice, and so thoroughly woven into the logistics architecture of both nations that most people forgot it existed, including, apparently, the individuals who chose to dismantle it. One revelation that surprises many Americans and reportedly shocked the President of the United States when it was explained during an intelligence briefing, is who actually controls substantial portions of this system. Canadian National Railway, headquartered in Montreal, operates a rail network extending from Canada's Atlantic coastline all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Its American operations span Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Tennessee. CN does not merely transport Canadian products across the border. It moves American goods within the United States itself, grain from the Midwest to Gulf terminals, chemicals from Louisiana to northeastern factories, and automotive components moving between facilities across the industrial heartland. Canadian Pacific Kansas City, headquartered in Calgary, was created through the merger of Canadian Pacific Railway and Kansas City Southern. The outcome was the only single-line rail network directly connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico. CPKC operates throughout the American Midwest, the Southern Plains, the Gulf Coast, and into Mexico, transporting everything from potash and petroleum to intermodal containers. These are not marginal companies supplementing an American-controlled system. CN and CPKC are two of the 7 Class I railroads across North America, the classification reserved for the continent's largest freight operators. Combined with their domestic networks, they command a substantial portion of cross-border freight movement. They own the tracks, they own the locomotives, they own the rail cars, they employ the crews, they coordinate the trains, they distribute the capacity, and those decisions are ultimately reached in Canadian boardrooms under Canadian corporate governance, reflecting Canadian commercial priorities. What these railways transport for the American economy resembles a comprehensive inventory of the country itself. Grain from Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, crude oil from Canadian fields to American refineries, automotive components moving between cross-border manufacturing facilities, chemicals, fertilizers, lumber, steel, potash, manufactured products, and intermodal containers carrying electronics and apparel from Pacific ports to inland distribution centers. Modern freight logistics operates on precision. Rail cars are timetabled to arrive within hours of when they are required. Inventory systems are calibrated around rail delivery schedules. Production timelines are constructed around the assumption that the freight will flow. There is no strategic stockpile of auto parts sitting in warehouses. There is no backup grain terminal prepared to absorb a harvest that cannot move. The system functions only because it is dependable, and it was dependable because the cross-border relationship operated smoothly. When the relationship fractured, the dependability fractured alongside it, and nobody in Washington had calculated what would happen afterward. The disruption did not arrive in one dramatic instant. It arrived the same way every crisis in this confrontation has appeared, through cascading secondary consequences that the architects of the trade conflict never anticipated because they concentrated only on the immediate effects of their own measures. As Canada rerouted exports away from the United States toward markets in Europe, the United Kingdom, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific, demand for north-south rail capacity declined. Fewer Canadian products heading south meant fewer trains heading south. Simultaneously, demand for east-west rail capacity surged as Canadian producers needed to transport goods to port cities for international export: Halifax and Montreal on the Atlantic, Vancouver and Prince Rupert on the Pacific. Ports expanded. Rail traffic to those ports increased. And CN and CPKC, operating as rational enterprises responding to market forces, reallocated capacity accordingly. More trains traveled east and west. Fewer trains traveled south. This transition was not mandated by the Canadian government. It was not ideological. It was commercial. Capacity follows demand. Demand follows commerce. And commerce had been deliberately redirected by the very tariffs and restrictions imposed by the United States itself. The result was a gradual deterioration in the reliability of cross-border rail logistics for American shippers. American freight was not obstructed. It was simply deprioritized. Shipments moved later, slower, and with diminished predictability, and in a logistics network built on precise timing, later and slower eventually mean the entire downstream economy, factories, distribution hubs, retailers, and consumers, begins to seize up. The consequences materialized slowly and then all at once. Midwestern grain elevators filled to capacity and remained full. Farmers harvested crops with nowhere to store them because trains that routinely carried grain to export terminals arrived less frequently and less reliably. Grain sitting for weeks instead of days began deteriorating, losing quality, certification, and market value. Millions of tons of American grain suddenly faced spoilage, not because of drought, disease, or natural calamity, but because the trains that previously carried it south were now running east and west. The automotive sector confronted a parallel emergency. Canadian parts restrictions had already slowed assembly lines. Now the logistics network delivering the remaining components began deteriorating as well. Parts cleared customs barriers but sat in rail yards awaiting capacity. Components that once arrived within hours began arriving weeks later. Energy shipments decelerated. Chemical facilities reported delays. Retail distribution centers reported inventory shortfalls. Trucking, the only substitute, costs 3 to 5 times more per ton-mile and lacks the capacity to replace rail. The American Logistics Association characterized it as the most severe freight disruption since the Second World War. The projected economic cost, $573 billion across 3 years. And then, for the first time in the history of the modern bilateral relationship, an American president sought Canadian assistance. The administration proposed a joint North American railway stabilization framework, a bilateral arrangement designed to restore complete cross-border freight service and guarantee American shippers priority access to Canadian rail networks. The diplomatic language characterized it as cooperation. The underlying reality was more straightforward: the United States asking Canada to restore a service that American industry cannot operate without. Canada declined. Instead, it unveiled the $30 billion East-West Rail Corridor, the most ambitious rail infrastructure investment in Canadian history. Expanded capacity to Vancouver and Prince Rupert for Asian markets. Expanded capacity to Halifax and Montreal for European markets. New intermodal terminals connecting inland production to both coastlines. Double tracking and upgrades along the transcontinental main lines. And a new supply chain stretching from Canadian mines to Canadian railways to Canadian ports and onward to global markets, with the United States absent from that chain entirely. Every dollar committed to East-West infrastructure strengthens Canadian trade with the world. Every new train on that corridor is a train no longer available for north-south operations. Warren Buffett distilled the lesson with devastating economy. You cannot wage economic war on the country that owns your railways and expect the trains to run on time, and Mark Carney condensed it even more directly. You don't get to break it and then ask us to fix it.